all of you to my presentation today. So in my presentation, I'm going to talk about my research. Um, it is on Vietnamese about students' perceptions of the use of vocabulary notebooks to improve vocabulary acquisition. There are five main parts in my presentation: statement of research problem, literature review, research setting and cultural aspects, methodology and methods, and last but not least, that is ethics and anticipated problems. So let's move on to the first part. I'm going to explain why this research is important to my teaching practices. So I have been working with my students for more than a year, and from my observation, my students have always been struggling to express themselves orally in English, and in particular, they couldn't recall or reproduce vocabulary items that were previously introduced in the course. Therefore, I started to reflect on my teaching practice and came to understand that there was a greater emphasis on communicative activities than language-focused learning. And according to Nation 2007, a well-balanced language course must consist of four equal strengths: meaning-focused output, meaning-focused input, fluency development, and language-focused learning. And however, in my case, my students were expected to implicitly acquire vocabulary items through reading and listening. But I think that alone doesn't really work, especially for my students whose level is just around low intermediate to intermediate, and also their understanding of vocabulary learning is quite limited. They assume that knowing word meaning equals knowing a word. Therefore, I think that there is strong need for a pedagogical intervention that assists my students' vocabulary learning. And after literature searching, I decided to adopt vocabulary notebooks to improve my students' vocabulary acquisition. At the end of the research, I expect to examine my students. In this research, I expect to examine my students' perceptions towards the use of vocabulary notebooks to improve their vocabulary acquisition. And now moving on to the second part, which is literature review. I'm going to explain some key terms in my research. So innovation has been a major area within the field of education. And according to Michaelishin, Condor, and Thurman, 2018, education is of great importance compared to other markets within the national innovation system. And innovation is a new and creative idea that is expected to bring about positive changes or progressive development. However, according to Alice 2017, the idea of innovation is not necessarily refreshingly new. What does matter is in the way it is adopted in a specific context. So in my research, the idea for innovation can be borrowed or original as long as it creates a positive impact in a particular context. And the innovativeness of my research is built upon its relevance to my students' needs, its adaptability to my teaching context, its continuous reflection during the process, and its networked power between me as a teacher researcher and my students. So speaking of my innovation in this research, I'm going to use vocabulary notebooks. And according to Mark Crosby, vocabulary notebook refers to any form of notebook used for recording new and useful vocabulary items, and some additional information about the word. Actually, awareness of the benefits of vocabulary notebooks is not recent. It has been described and mentioned for the past few decades by Allen 1983, Grain and Dredman 1986, McCarthy 1990, and Smith 1995. And after literature searching some relevant studies, related to vocabulary notebooks around Asia, I found that on the vocabulary notebook is not a common is a common practice. Is a common practice. My students are most students are not really aware of how to create a pedagogically sound vocabulary notebook. Um, so now let's turn to research setting and cultural aspects. My research will be conducted in Hanoi University of Industry, which is a quite positive academic environment in which my students in which students and teachers are encouraged to do research. And also my participants are second year students majoring in translation and interpretation. Therefore, they are quite highly motivated to um, to 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 learn English, and also they are aware of the importance of English in their future job. So let's move on to the next part, methodology and methods. So in this research, I'm going to use a qualitative approach for some reasons. First of all, my research objectives is to examine students' perceptions towards the use of vocabulary notebooks. And as an interpretivist, I believe that human perceptions vary from one person to another. Therefore, qualitative methods offer an effective way of understanding individual experiences in detail. Um, and second, my research has a small sample. Only 4 or 5 participants will be invited in the research. Therefore, I'm not really worried about analyzing a large amount of qualitative data later in the research. And there are 3 research methods in my research. They are students' diaries, document analysis, and individual semi-structured interviews. So every week, my students will submit their vocabulary notebooks. Every week, my students will be asked to write diaries to record their learning experiences with vocabulary notebooks, and also they will submit their vocabulary notebooks for teachers to review and give feedback. So by doing this, my students will be more mindful of the practice, and also as a researcher, I can somehow anticipate my students' problems and difficulties during the process. And at the end of the research, individual semi-structured interviews will be conducted. So by having an actual conversation with my students, I could understand their problems and their difficulties more in detail. And for the data analysis, I will be using thematic analysis to analyze the data. In this project, there will be a 4-week course, and at the beginning of the course, an introductory session will be conducted in which my students will be informed of what vocabulary notebook is like. Vocabulary notebook format, principles and aspects of vocabulary learning, and so on. And there will be 2 90-minute face-to-face sessions. So on the first lesson, students will study vocabulary through listening and reading, and they'll be asked to produce a vocabulary notebook at home and send it to teachers before the second lesson. And on the second lesson, students will be doing some notebook-based activities to have them recycle their vocabulary items that they have learned before. So let's move on to the last part of my presentation, ethics and anticipated problems. So at the beginning of the research, I would need to ask for my institution's permissions, and also I would send a informed consent to my students to make sure that my students are aware of what they are expected to do in the research, and also they can make their own decision whether they want to participate in the research or not. And all of the information in the research will be kept confidential, and no one could be allowed to access the information except the researcher. And in terms of anticipated problems, my most concerning problems is maybe time constraints. I think it would be hard for me and my students to arrange two lessons every week. So I will be thinking about evening classes or weekend classes, which may make it possible. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for your listening.